Hare Krishna. Welcome, dear devotees. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have been celebrating Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita for the past 2 weeks, and we have 3 more weeks of wonderful lineup of speakers that are going to help us dive deeper into studying Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita and really set the mood for the upcoming Gaur Purnima festival. So today with us here, we have His Grace Radhika Raman Prabhu. Radhika Raman Prabhu. Hare Krishna, Radhika Raman Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, so good to see you.
So nice to see you too, Prabhu. Please accept my humble obeisances.
Please accept mine. All glory to Srila Prabhupada.
Right, wonderful. It's always such a pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
Radhika Raman, a very well-known devotee, and he really does not need an introduction. But for my own purification, I want to share a few things about him. Radhika Raman Prabhu is actually the pioneer, if I can put it in that way, for devotees getting inspired to homeschool their children. I've attended seminars of him traveling with his mother and really sharing his experience about being homeschooled. And you can see what a fine example of devotion, scholarship, education, and what a balanced life that most parents aspire to see in their children. So thank you for such a wonderful example that you're setting. You make us all so very proud. And you're definitely one of those devotees. Actually, in fact, on one of the streams in this very series of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, we had one of the speakers who said that Radhika Raman Prabhu is 1 in a million. So it's such an honor to welcome you on this platform, apart from all the wonderful degrees that you have, your PhD at Oxford, your connection with, you're a faculty even at the Bhaktivedanta GVC College. Last year you were at the GVC College, you're a faculty at the Bhaktivedanta College, and the Oxford Center of Hindu Studies, so many places. And apart from all of that, what I really see is your humility and your genuineness to practice bhakti is very, very inspirational for the second generation and for so many of us that see you as a very, very shining example. And, like I like to say, our future looks bright when we see examples like you. So thank you so much for your wonderful example and for being here and sharing your time with us on this platform. I want to invite you to, highlight Srimad Mahaprabhu as a philosopher. And like you mentioned, it's beautiful. You're going to take us into the dialogues with Srila Sarvabhauma Bhattacarya and Prakasananda Saraswati. So the stage is all yours, Prabhu. And we request all our viewers, if you have any questions, comments, appreciation, please post them in the chat and continue to share this video with your friends. We already see quite a lot of people are liking it already, and we have a lot of people already starting to join online. So Radhika Raman Prabhu, please. Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really, really do appreciate it. I'll take them as your blessings, that maybe one day I can live up to your words and to the expectations of the Vaishnavas. But I want to thank you very much sincerely for inviting me to speak today, and to the committee that organizes these events, and for giving me this opportunity to speak about Mahaprabhu and to meditate on him on the days leading up to Sri Gaur Purnima. So it's really, I'm grateful to be here with you and for all the devotees, with all the devotees that I cannot see, but hopefully you'll send in your questions and comments that we can have some interaction afterwards. So
thank you so much, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So I want to begin by reading a verse from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita in Adi Leela, chapter 7, which is the story of Prakasananda Saraswati. It's actually, the account of Prakasananda Saraswati is given twice in Chaitanya Charitamrita. So important it is. The first time it's given in more detail in the section of Adi Leela where Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami is establishing the foundational principles of our philosophy and theology. And then the second time it's presented in chronological order later on when Mahaprabhu is on his way to Vrindavan. So it's given actually twice. And I think this speaks to the importance of this katha of Prakashananda Saraswati's deliverance by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So if we could please share my screen, then we can come to this verse, Adi Leela, chapter 7, text 102. Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhaktavinda Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhaktavinda Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhaktavinda. Eto shuni hasi Prabhu bolila vachan Dukha namano hojadi kari nivedan. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. After hearing the Mayavadi sannyasis speak in that way, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu smiled slightly and said, "My dear sirs, if you don't mind, I can say something to you regarding Vedanta philosophy." Purport. The Mayavadi sannyasis, appreciating Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, inquired from him why he did not discuss Vedanta philosophy. Actually, however, the entire system of Vaishnava activities is based on Vedanta philosophy. Vaishnavas do not neglect Vedanta, but they do not care to understand Vedanta on the basis of the Shariraka Bhashya commentary. Therefore, to clarify the situation, Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, with the permission of the Mayavadi sannyasis, wanted to speak regarding Vedanta philosophy. The Vaishnavas are by far the greatest philosophers in the world, and the greatest among them was Srila Jiva Goswami Prabhu, whose philosophy was again presented less than 400 years later by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj. Therefore, one must know very well that Vaishnava philosophers are not sentimentalists or cheap devotees like the Sahajiyas. All the Vaishnava acharyas were vastly learned scholars who understood Vedanta philosophy fully, for unless one knows Vedanta philosophy, he cannot be an acharya. To be accepted as an acharya among Indian transcendentalists who follow the Vedic principles, one must become a vastly learned scholar in Vedanta philosophy, either by studying it or hearing it. Bhakti develops in pursuance of Vedanta philosophy. This is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 1:2-12. Tachraddhana munayo jnana vairagya yuktaya pashyantyatmani chatmanam bhaktya shrutagrihitaya. The word bhaktya shrutagrihitaya in this verse are very important, for they indicate that bhakti must be based upon the philosophy of the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutra. Srila Rupa Goswami said, Shruti Smriti Puranadi Pancharatra Vidhim Vina Aikantiki Harer Bhaktir Utpatayaiva Kalpate. Devotional service performed without reference to the Vedas, Puranas, Pancharatras, etc. must be considered sentimentalism, and it causes nothing but disturbance to society. There are different grades of Vaishnavas, Kanishta Adhikari, Madhyama Adhikari, and Uttama Adhikari. But to be a Madhyama Adhikari preacher, one must be a learned scholar in the Vedanta Sutra and other Vedic literatures, because when Bhakti Yoga develops on the basis of Vedanta philosophy, it is factual and steady. And at this point, Srila Prabhupada quotes the entire translation and purport for that verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhaktya Shrutagrihitaya. So I will pause at this point, and we can stop sharing. Yeah. So I remember, let's see, some 20 some years ago when I was first considering doing my PhD, and I noticed something in the academic literature that speaks about or discusses the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and the history of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's life. And what I noticed was that everywhere I read, Mahaprabhu was counted as one of the great ecstatic saints of India who brought a wave of bhakti all across the Indian subcontinent, who was himself very ecstatic as a saint. But he was never counted amongst India's great philosophers. Not only Mahaprabhu, but none of his followers, the Goswamis of Vrindavan, for example, were also counted amongst the philosophers of India, particularly the great Vedantists who have taught and preached in India for now, 1,000 years in the past and more. So it was something very striking and very distressing to see that despite Mahaprabhu's movement being so prolific in its production of intellectual, scholarly literature and poetic literature, I mean, just in the past 500 years, the volume of philosophical and poetic writing that has been written by the Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas has been amazing. It's been incredible. It's actually quite shocking to see how much has been written in such a short period of time. Most traditions take a lot longer to produce this kind of literary output. And yet, despite that, Mahaprabhu was never counted amongst the thinkers and philosophers of India, nor were his followers, alongside such luminaries as Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, and so on. So this is what inspired me to work on Srila Jiva Goswami in particular, and Srila Prabhupada, as he does in this purport, he describes him as being he says here, the exact words, "The Vaishnavas are by far the greatest philosophers in the world, and the greatest among them was Srila Jiva Goswami Prabhu." So it's really, this is very much a part of our sampradaya. And I thought, well, why don't I work on Srila Jiva Goswami Sandarbhas? And since then, so many devotees have, Vaishnav scholars, many of them trained in Oxford at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, have done such a wonderful job in bringing out the philosophical production, philosophical material that the Goswamis of Vrindavan and as well as the Acharyas in Bengal have done over the past 500 years, and bringing it to light amongst the academic community and the scholarly community so that a much wider audience can appreciate the contribution of our sampradaya. But what I want to point out here is that this lack of recognition is not something that is unusual or new. In fact, it goes back all the way to the time of Sri Mahaprabhu himself. There's this sense, there's this idea that Vaishnavas are very emotional and very devotional and perhaps sentimental, but incapable of thinking philosophically, because that's for the Advaitins, that's for the non-dualists, that's for the philosophers and the logicians, whereas devotees spend their time just singing and dancing, which is of course true. We spend most of our time singing and dancing and worshiping the Lord. But that does not preclude Vaishnavas from engaging in philosophical work. All the way back to the time of Mahaprabhu himself, specifically in this story of Prakashananda Saraswati, this criticism was raised. So when Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was on his way to Vrindavan Dham, then along the way he stops in Benares. And there he comes to hear about the criticisms that are being lodged against him, where the Mayavadi sannyasis of Benares are calling him names like bhavuka, which means you are a sentimentalist, an emotionalist. And it's nice that you dance and chant with all these common people. Basically, their point is these unintelligent commoners. But isn't it the job of a sannyasi to study Vedanta? And why don't you spend your time with us studying Vedanta? So this word bhavuka, just as an aside, is very interesting because Prakashananda Saraswati is using it as a criticism against Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You're a sentimentalist. But actually, this word bhavuka we can take in a different way, namely in Srimad Bhagavatam. Srila Vyasadeva calls on us to become bhavukas, right? Nigamakalpataror galitam phalam shukamukhad amritadrava samyutam. Pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavuka. That this Bhagavatam can be appreciated only by those who are rasikas, who are connoisseurs of rasa, of taste, of flavor, of relationship and mellow, and bhavukas, those who have some emotion there. So, like with so many criticisms that are lodged against the Lord in his different avatars, those criticisms can actually be taken as praise. And in this case, Mahaprabhu, yes, he's the finest bhavuka and rasika who can appreciate Srimad Bhagavatam. Anyway, the point being that this criticism was something that was there 500 years ago, and during Mahaprabhu's time. And this leads to the wonderful Leela of Prakashananda Saraswati. When Mahaprabhu is on his way back from Vrindavan, he accepts hospitality at the homes of Tapan Mishra and Chandrasekhar Acharya. And they place a petition before the Lord to say that we have been hearing all these criticisms of you and of the devotees, and it is difficult for us to tolerate hearing people criticize you as being unintelligent or being emotional. And will you please do something to turn these criticisms away, to refute them? And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, although initially he's not very interested in engaging, on his way to Vrindavan, he's not interested, but on his way back, he says, okay, we can do so. And one very nice Maharashtrian Brahmin invites Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to his home and invites the Mayavadi sannyasis, Prakashananda Saraswati and his disciples to his home as well. And as they gather, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu arrives, and he immediately, the place where he washes his hands and feet, he washes his hands and feet and then sits down in that same place. And which is not a place to sit where you wash your feet. And yet he expresses his humility that way. And all the sannyasis, they see this, and Prakashananda Saraswati comes to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and he says, please join us. Why are you sitting here? In fact, at that point when Mahaprabhu sits down there, they see his beauty and his effulgence, and they're struck with wonder. And so they're moved to say, you're actually so, you're like Lord Narayan himself. You're so effulgent and you're so brilliant, and yet you're sitting like this on the floor over here. Why don't you please join us? And they take him by the hand and they request him to sit amongst them. And at that point, the discussion begins. And Prakasananda Saraswati makes this point. He says, we don't mind the fact that you engage in Harinam Sankirtan, but why don't you study Vedanta with us? Krishna Kirtan is nice, but Vedanta is your duty as a sannyasi. And initially, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, again, he expresses his humility by saying, my guru saw that I was a fool, and therefore he said, I'm not qualified to study Vedanta like all of you. Instead, he told me only to chant this Hare Krishna Mahamantra. And he tells the story of his transformation after initiation from Ishwarapuri. So it's a very wonderful account that Mahaprabhu gives, and he glorifies the chanting of the holy names as the highest and most important form of worship and practice, much higher than the study of Vedanta. And after this, the Prakasananda Saraswati and the others, again, they submit themselves and they say, we don't think this is wrong, what you're saying. In fact, we trust that everything you say is going to be reasonable, right? It's going to be good. But please, we want to speak about Vedanta. Why don't you speak about this? And Mahaprabhu at that point, he says, yes, we can discuss Vedanta. And that's when he begins his philosophical discussion, offering an expert refutation of Shankaracharya's Shariraka Bhashya, his Mayavad interpretation of the Vedanta Sutra, and speaking about the Vaishnava conclusion, the Gaudiya Vaishnava understanding of the Lord as personal, full of Shaktis, and encompassing all energies and all potencies and opulences amongst him, within him. And in this way, he convinces them. He discusses also Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayojan. And by the end of it, the sannyasis their hearts are changed. And they not only are convinced, but they take up the chanting of Krishna's holy names, which was the whole point all along, is to get them to appreciate the glories of the name. So I want to highlight a few things in this account that are very special and very distinctive to how Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu addresses these challenges that he has. These factors that I want to talk about are also actually present in the account of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, which I will point out along the way as well. So, first of all, we see that Mahaprabhu, basically Mahaprabhu convinces Prakasananda Saraswati and his disciples through three things, right? Those are his effulgence, his humility, and his philosophical acumen, his philosophical discussion and argument. So three things: effulgence, humility, and philosophy. Now, if we look at these three things, we find that these three qualities are very relevant even for us as we engage in intellectual discourse with people in our own times. In other words, Mahaprabhu provides an example for all Vaishnavas, for all devotees who want to engage in the study and teaching of Vedanta philosophy according to the conclusions of the Vaishnavacharyas in the way that Srila Prabhupada has discussed in the purport that we just read. Now, with the first one, namely his effulgence, now, naturally, it's not something that we can necessarily display, is our Brahman effulgence, like the way the Lord did. However, there is something that is very relevant here, namely that devotees do have a certain kind of effulgence to them. This is something that we hear often from people who say that you Hare Krishnas look so bright and you look so happy and you look like you have a glow about you, that you float through this world. And that's real. It's not just perceived, it's real. That if quote unquote effulgence is something that we can try to cultivate through purity of character, right? Through purity of character and the practice of sadhana nicely. That when we practice in such a way that we are faithful to our Guru Parampara, we're faithful to Srila Prabhupada, and we devoutly try to follow his instructions to the best of our ability, this naturally creates purity in the character and in the mind of a Vaishnava. And that purity is very attractive. In fact, a Vaishnava is able to convince others to the degree that we have that purity in our own character. Right? So yes, so that effulgence is something that we can understand in our own limited capacity, not like the Lord, of course, but by trying to follow the instructions of the spiritual master in a faithful way. Now, the second thing that he displays is humility. And I want to say something more about this. We know, of course, that humility is the jewel of a Vaishnava, and it's especially the jewel of one who has knowledge and who works with others who are knowledgeable. The reason for this is because knowledge, I should say mundane knowledge, by its very nature, is such that it is easily productive of pride. It easily produces pride in a person. Any kind of qualification in this world, it's in some ways a natural consequence of any qualification in this world is the cultivation of pride. And so when someone has knowledge, and that knowledge is accompanied by humility, it's decorated by humility, then it becomes very powerful. It becomes actually irresistible. And without that humility, that knowledge is compared to the jewel on the head of a serpent. Very attractive, but completely inaccessible, completely useless to the world. Because who's going to approach a snake, right? So Mahaprabhu's humility was evident from his not asking for a seat of honor, by his honoring, so that's amanina, and then his honoring the assembled persons there as superior to him, even though that was not the case. But he offered his genuine appreciation for who they were. They were very, very qualified, very renounced, and very knowledgeable, very experienced sannyasis. And that was deserving of honor. So Mahaprabhu was not merely making a show of humility. He was not merely just, pretending to be humble as a sort of public relations stunt. No, he was genuinely honoring who they were and their qualification. And the most important way in which he does this is by first listening to them and speaking when the opportunity arose. He says at one point, if you don't mind, I will say something. And we see this very distinctively in the story of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya also, where Mahaprabhu spends 7 days listening to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. His humility there is incredible. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya comes to him and basically tells him that you are a lower class sannyasi because you're in the Bharati order and you are young, right? 2 disqualifications you have. You're initiated in a lower order of sannyasis and you're too young. And so I'm going to cure at least the first one, right? So that you can maintain your sannyas even in your youth, implying that Mahaprabhu was perhaps, because he was young, he was in a dangerous position as a sannyasi in terms of trying to control his desires. And so the study of Vedanta would help him overcome his youth as a flaw, and it would help him overcome his lower status. And he would reinitiate him into a higher order of sannyas. This is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's offer. I mean, think about this, how For anyone in this world, that would be a pretty big insult. To be told these two things and then to be offered that. And yet Mahaprabhu is so humble about the whole thing. He tells him, you are at the level of my father. You are just like my father. You are my superior. You are like my guru, he says. And therefore, although the devotees are disturbed by Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's offer, Mahaprabhu tells them, why are you upset? He is doing this out of parental affection for me. He wants the best for me. See how he takes the best intention possible from Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. He could have taken the intention as, look at how arrogant he is, how dare he think who he is, and I'll show him, how much knowledge he thinks he has, etc. And of course, Mahaprabhu would have won that debate, being the Supreme Lord. But that's not the approach he took. He says, I want to take him up on his very kind offer because he's speaking so generously. And for 7 days, he listens very carefully to what Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya has to say. Now, here's the thing. When we engage in this kind of humility, the way that Mahaprabhu showed in both instances, particularly when we're humble towards one who is qualified, this develops a relationship with that person. And that relationship builds a sense of trust. And when we have trust, we are able to actually express and speak and be heard. In other words, when we listen, we are able to speak. Now, we can go and talk anytime we want, but that's not talking, that's just speaking at someone or speaking past someone. If we want to be heard, we have to first listen. And if we listen, we build a relationship, we build trust, and most importantly, we build humility in that person's heart. They are softened, they open themselves up. It says, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says that by this humility of Mahaprabhu, the sannyasis became somewhat humble. And you know what they tell him? The sannyasis say, we believe that your words will never be unreasonable. Therefore, you may speak. Now, I want you to think of those words again. So meaningful, so powerful. This is before the philosophical discussion has taken place. The only thing Mahaprabhu has done is expressed his humility towards these sannyasis. These sannyasis with whom he disagrees and who have criticized him. And after he expresses this humility, the sannyasis tell him, we believe that your words will never be unreasonable. Therefore, you may speak. In any relationship, in any dialogue, in any discussion, in any debate, if we are able to come to this point where the opposite party, they won't say, I agree with you. I think you're right. I think you're the best. They're not going to say that. That's unreasonable to expect. But if we come to a point where the other person has enough trust in us that they can say, we believe that your words will be reasonable, right? We think you're a reasonable person, and therefore it's worth listening to you. That you're not going to say something that is off the wall, that is insulting, that is crazy, that is unreasonable. No, we know you're a gentleman, and what you speak is going to be reasonable and intelligent. If we can get to that point before a discussion by building relationship and building trust, then we know that it is worth speaking. Otherwise, frankly, it's not worth speaking. It may be better to walk away from the situation or not to engage to start off with, right? Just like Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did not engage initially with the sannyasis there. So if we don't feel we're ready to engage for whatever reason, then we can avoid. We can back out, or we can not engage to begin with, and that's okay. There are times to remain quiet, and there are times to speak up. There are times to listen, and there are times to speak up. But if we're going to speak up, then we should first make sure that the other side is actually going to listen. Otherwise, no point in speaking up. We may decide that it's not worth listening either, and then we politely step out of the situation. Say, for example, the discussion is becoming totally, it's turning into an angry debate that has no direction. The person we're talking to is not willing to actually have a reasonable discussion. This is just becoming a shouting match. If that's the case, then we can bow out of the situation, politely excuse ourselves. So we don't necessarily have to always listen. But if we want to speak, then there must be first that process of listening, building relationships, and building that trust. And if that is there, then we know that our words will be heard. And in both instances, with Prakasananda Saraswati and Sarvabhauma Bhattacarya, the Lord very expertly did this. He built a relationship, built a connection through their joint past, with, in the case of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, their connection through Nilambar Chakravarti, or he tells him his story, right? What's the purpose of telling his own story to Prakasananda Saraswati? Here's my guru, this is what happened, is it helps them understand where Mahaprabhu is coming from. And it helps them reach out in that relationship. So that's one very important thing to note there in that conversation. The Lord's effulgence, but then his humility as well in the whole process. Now, one very interesting thing in the conversation with Prakasananda Saraswati is that Prakashananda refers to the conversion of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. In other words, we see the far-reaching impacts of developing such relationships. They take time and energy. Mahaprabhu, he traveled all across India, and he brought a flood of love of God everywhere he went. Just by seeing him, or hearing his chanting of the holy names, or by touching him, people were transformed, their hearts were purified, and they were overcome. It often took just a moment or two. And yet Mahaprabhu spent a week with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. And we see the far-reaching effects of that effort that he put in with Sarvabhauma, that all across India, this event of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's liberation had ripple effects across the intellectual communities of India. Prakashananda Saraswati mentions it. In fact, he's so confused by the idea that Sarvabhauma, such a well-known scholar and teacher, that he would take up this emotional, sentimental path, as he thinks it is. He's so confused by it that he decides that Mahaprabhu must know some magic by which he has changed Sarvabhauma's mind. That's the only good reason he can come up with, because he doesn't yet see that there's any good intellectual reason why Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya would want to join Mahaprabhu's fold. And Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami actually says, this beautiful section at the end of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's chapter. At the end, he says, just like a touchstone is never known until it touches iron and turns it into gold, right? So the quality of a touchstone is that when it touches iron, it turns it into gold. So he says that a touchstone looks like just any other rock. And no one knows its amazing qualities until it touches iron and changes that iron into gold. He says in the same way, people did not realize who Sri Mahaprabhu was, that he is Krishna himself, until he touched Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's heart and changed him. At that point, he says, his fame is spread all over India. Everyone knows who Mahaprabhu is. Everyone's talking. Did you hear the great philosopher Vasudev Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, that he changed? In fact, Vasudev Sarvabhauma was such a well-known scholar that his works on Nyaya or logic are still studied by scholars. His works that he wrote before he became a devotee of Mahaprabhu, right, are studied by scholars today, which means that he had a very great reputation. And if you read that chapter carefully, Chaitanya Charitamrita, that chapter, you find in their discussions that Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was part of a pan-Indian network of scholars, stretching out all the way to to Navadvip, of course. And then we see here in Banaras, he's connected. Everyone knows who he is. He knows who they are. He has studied with some of the great luminaries of his time. So he's very, very well connected in that network. And his change of heart really has a very powerful effect on Mahaprabhu's movement. It brings a whole nother dimension to it, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami tells us. Finally, the last thing to mention, there was the effulgence, there was his humility, and finally, his Sri Chaitanya's philosophical acumen, his philosophical strength and intelligence. And I want to say a few words about this element as well. There are, in both of these accounts, when Prakasananda Saraswati, with Prakasananda Saraswati and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, there are certain things that are common that Mahaprabhu discusses in both of these accounts. The key things that are common, philosophically speaking, is that he focuses on, the Lord's personal quality, that Krishna is a person, and that he is the reservoir of all Shaktis, of all energies. So this is the distinctly Gaudiya Vaishnava understanding of the Lord, Shakti Parinambhada, that the Lord is personal and he is the source of all Shaktis. And it is these energies that transform into the material and spiritual worlds. Then he discusses, or not in this necessary order, I'm just collecting a few things there, but he also discusses Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan. Basically, to put it in simple terms, these are the key questions at stake in any philosophical discussion. Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayojan. Okay? Namely, who we are, Sambandha, where do we want to go, Prayojan, and how do we get there, Abhideya. Okay? So anytime we're discussing any philosophical tradition or theological tradition, these are the three things that we naturally examine. Who are we? Where do we stand? Right? What is the current situation? Sambandha. What is reality like? And then what is the ultimate good? What are we trying to achieve? Every philosopher their philosophy is defined by how they describe the ultimate good, what is worth achieving for human beings. This is Prayojan. And then Abhideya. How do we get there? What is the way to get from our current situation? What is the nature of reality to where we want to go? What is the process? So he talks about these three. These three, Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayojan, are actually tied very closely to the three standard categories of philosophy in the West, which are metaphysics, epistemology, and praxeology. So metaphysics asks the question, what is reality? Epistemology asks us, how do we know that reality? And praxeology is the question, how do we live in accordance with that reality? So what is reality? How do we know it? And how do we live in accordance with it? And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu addresses all three of these questions, metaphysics, epistemology, and praxeology, in his discussion with both Prakasananda Saraswati and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. When he speaks about the difference between the Lord and the living entities, as well as the Lord's unlimited energies, his Shaktis, this is the heart of Vaishnava metaphysics. And then he speaks at length in both discussions how it's so important to take the direct meaning of Scripture, that the only way that we're going to be able to understand the nature of the Lord and his energies is by taking the primary meaning of Shastra, not indirectly twisting out some meaning, but taking the plain meaning that is present there. And this is epistemology. How do we understand Shastra, or also called hermeneutics? How do we understand, explain, interpret properly the scriptures? So if we know epistemology, if we know how to understand properly, and then we use that, then when we understand scripture, we will find the right metaphysics, namely the nature of the Lord and his energies. And then Mahaprabhu speaks about praxeology, how if we know the nature of the Lord and his living and his energies, then how do we want to live? How do we want to practice? And that he gives us the final point in each of these discussions, is that the most important element of practice is chanting of Krishna's holy names. In both of these dialogues, he quotes and emphasizes and explains that most important verse, Harer Nama, Harer Nama, Harer Nama eva kevalam, Kalo nasteva, 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 gatiranyatha. That in this age of Kali, the only way that we can achieve perfection is through chanting of Krishna's holy names, Hare Nama, Hare Nama. Not by any other means, by any other means, by any other means. So in this way, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he gives us a wonderful example for how to present his philosophy, how to present the Gaudiya Vaishnava Siddhanta to any audience, particularly a learned audience, through our purity of character, our faithfulness of practice, through our humility that leads to building a relationship with those who we speak to, and through philosophical intelligence and acumen that demonstrates the Siddhanta that is found in the Vedic literature. And when these three things are there, then the results can be very, very wonderful. They can be very powerful. In fact, even one person who is convinced like this, of the caliber of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, can have such a wonderful effect on society in so many ways, right? In so many ways. So, of course, this takes effort. It takes practice. It takes a lot of humility in order to do this. And most importantly, we have to also recognize our own limits, right? So Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu spent 7 days listening to Mayavad philosophy. And yes, we have to listen. Otherwise we cannot speak, as I mentioned. But we also have to recognize our own limits, right? That do I have the spiritual maturity to be able to listen for that long, right? Maybe yes, maybe not. And maybe I have to speak up sooner, or maybe we have to find different ways. But we have to understand it's very important. Part of humility, in fact, the first step in humility is honesty. The first step in humility is for us to recognize who we are, what is our limitations, and what is our ability. Krishna has given each of us some asset, some ability to serve him. And we should not deny that ability. If we deny that ability, we deny that asset, then we actually, this is a mistake. It's an offense to the Lord, because everything that he has given us, it is necessary. It is required that we use it in his service. Just like if Krishna gives us wealth, then that wealth turns into poison unless we use it for Krishna, right? If Krishna has given us some capacity in this world, the ability to do anything, we have to use it in his service. So humility begins with honesty. Honest assessment of our own ability, that Krishna has given me this asset, let me use it in his service. Not that I try to deny it or avoid it or hide it. But at the same time, and the flip side is so important, that we also recognize our limitations. That we recognize that this is something that I am not able to do, that I should seek help for this purpose, or I should pray to the Lord to show guidance and what is the best time and what is the best way in order to do it. But in general, so we may have to apply this in different ways according to our own nature, our own ability, and according to our context. But the principle is the same, that we need this purity of practice, we need this humility and willingness to listen, and we need that philosophical strength, philosophical training that we can address properly. Right? These are the principles. So I'll just conclude by saying this simple point, which is that truth is eternal, right? Siddhanta is eternal. What Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is presented to Prakasananda Saraswati and to Sarvabhauma Bhattacarya is no different than what he presents to anyone else throughout his travels around the subcontinent. Everywhere it's the same Siddhanta, it's the same truth. He presents to Rupa Goswami, to Sanatana Goswami, to the Kurma Brahman, all these persons, and that Nityananda Prabhu presents to Jaga and Madhai, right? The truth is the same. It's eternal. It's consistent. But its application is always contextual. Truth is eternal, but its application is always contextual. And it behooves us, like Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did, and like Srila Jiva Goswami did in the generation after, is to understand that Siddhanta very, very deeply, to make it one with our hearts. Right? Guru Mukha Padma Vakya Chitite Koriya Aikya. That it becomes so deeply embedded in our hearts. Right? That Siddhanta, that ultimate principle. And yet, and at the same time rather, we have to also understand what are the concerns and needs and dominant philosophies of our own time. And then we have to take that eternal Siddhanta and apply it, address it in a way that it addresses the needs, the philosophies, the discourses of our time. To address the Sarvabhauma Bhattacharyas and Prakasananda Saraswatis of our time. And we see this in the works of Srila Jiva Goswami, how he wrote the Shat Sandarbhas and presented in such sharp light how Mahaprabhu's philosophy applies to the great dominant philosophies of that time, the different darshanas, Nyaya, logic, Vedanta, Sankhya, Yoga, all of these things Jiva Goswami is addressing. What are the dominant debates of that time? And then we see it in the work of our own Srila Prabhupada. When he writes his wonderful Bhaktivedanta purports, Srila Prabhupada takes that same eternal Siddhanta and he deploys it to address the concerns, the needs, the discourses of our time, of our generation. And so, for example, in describing how the spirit soul, that the body is inert, that it's dead, that it's dead matter, and that to animate the body, you need the spirit soul, right, to make it act. To make this fundamental point in our philosophy, Srila Jiva Goswami uses the example of the woodcutter and the axe. Right? He says, just like an axe cannot cut wood on its own. It's a tool, it's an instrument, that you need the living force behind it. The woodcutter, the person, is the one who deploys the axe. In the same way, the body is material. You need the spirit soul who animates and moves this body. in the same, so that's the example Srila Jiva Goswami gives in one particular verse, his commentary in one verse in Bhagavatam. And Srila Prabhupada updates that example with his wonderful example that you all are familiar with of car and driver. Right? Who, in our time today, who knows of woodcutters and axes? Practically no one, not even in India do people see woodcutters with axes anymore. Everything is done by bulldozers and machines and chainsaws. Right? So Prabhupada gives an example that is relevant to every person on this earth today, that of the car and the driver. So same eternal principle presented in new dress, and that's the principle, the fundamental principle behind such philosophical discussions. That truth is eternal, but its application is contextual. And as followers of Srila Prabhupada, as servants of Srila Prabhupada, and as heirs to this wonderful heritage that we have, that we should be so proud of, coming from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, the amazing discussions and the methods that he shows us. We are heir to this tradition from Mahaprabhu through the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan, through our Guru Parampara. And here in this purport that we read, Srila Prabhupada is specifically referencing his own spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj, whose appearance day just passed. Right? As wonderful exemplars of those who take this eternal Vedanta philosophy, the truths of Vedanta, and who explain it in a way that is relevant to the discourses of their time. So also as their heirs, it makes it our duty to do the same, to take this eternal Siddhanta and to address it to others, to dialogue with those who are our partners in this wonderful grand movement that we have, our partners in dialogues, our friends across different religions, different cultures, different philosophies, in science, and so many different areas. It's our duty to dialogue with our partners, to refute misconceptions, those who have become confused and misled by improper ideas and misconceptions and philosophical problems, to refute such ideas, and to help those who are seeking and searching, right, who are lost. So this becomes our duty to address these different audiences as faithfully and as expertly as we can, as is said in Srimad Bhagavatam, yathadhitam yathamati. So I will stop at this point and see if there are questions or comments that all of you might have. We can at least take a few.
Hare Krishna.
Oh, we just lost you, or at least I think I lost you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Such a wonderful presentation, and I'm really mesmerized by your ability to present such difficult subject matters also so eloquently and beautifully. Thank you so much. You know, I really appreciated your the 3 points that he brought out, you know, lives of devotee, the effulgence, humility, philosophical intelligence. And I must say that you're a shining example of all of that. We have a few questions, some relevant to the topic and some not relevant. I hope you're still willing to take them. You know, we have audiences from different parts, some new, some seasoned devotees, some veterans. We have, there's a lot of love pouring in. We have so many, we have Kuladri Prabhu, disciple of Srila Prabhupada, offering his obeisances, expressing his gratitude. We have, you know, Debasmita. She's saying that, thank you so much for your wonderful and relevant talk. We have some questions from someone on YouTube. And let's look at this question here. Well, here he's mentioning Jai Tirtha, Vyas Tirtha, Vanamali Mishra with the great Nyaya Shastris, logicians, who refuted Advaita Advaita Vedanta very congeniently. Vedantins will run hearing such great Vaishnavas. You probably understand this more than I do. Because for me, this is like,
Yes. Yeah. Actually, these persons are in the line of Srila Madhvacharya, our own sampradaya also. But the disciples of Srila Madhvacharya are the most amazing Vaishnav logicians to have ever walked the earth, and they provide the most hard-hitting and cutting refutations of Advaita philosophy, of Mayavad philosophy. So definitely this is the case. In fact, Srila Jiva Goswami in his Sandarbhas, he takes a lot of these arguments. When previous Vaishnavacharyas have done something well, Jiva Goswami finds no need to redo it in a new way. He'll simply quote from Ramanujacharya Sri Bhashya or from one of the works of Madhvacharya, and he gives them all credit in the Tattva Sandarbha. So he says there's no, why should we redo something that has already been done well? In fact, Srila Jiva Goswami even gives a lot of credit to the Advaitins. He says, when it comes time to discuss Brahman, so there's Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan, the Lord's impersonal feature, he says, there's no point in me discussing it in so much detail. The Advaitins have done it very nicely, and one can read their work to understand Brahman better, right? So he in his commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, Shastra Yonitvat, the fifth sutra, Vedanta Sutra, Srila Jiva Goswami quotes or accepts the interpretation of Shankaracharya on that commentary. Even though that's an interpretation that Ramanujacharya and Madhvacharya do not accept. Madhvacharya's default position is to reject everything that Shankaracharya does, because he says Shankaracharya was, he actually says Shankaracharya was a demonic force that came to this world. But Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu does not say this to Prakasananda Saraswati and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. In fact, he gives a very, very respectful and charitable approach towards Shankaracharya. He offers respects to him and says that none of your, as in Prakasananda Saraswati's, misconceptions, none of them are a result of Shankaracharya. That this is, Shankaracharya is actually a wonderful servant of the Lord. He's Lord Shiva himself, who's come in this form to serve the Lord. So in that mood, Jiva Goswami accepts Shankaracharya's interpretations when they are in confluence with the Vaishnava understanding. Even sometimes when other Vaishnavacharyas don't like it, Jiva Goswami says, no, it's good. Why? And he explains that the meaning of the sutra both in the way that Madhvacharya does and in the way that Shankaracharya does. In this way, bringing together two people who spent their entire lives fighting with one another and debating, he's resolving both of them together in a wonderful way. So my point in saying this is, yes, there has been so much debate, but we should also understand that Mahaprabhu's philosophy is unifying, right? Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he, of course, there are certain things that he clearly rejected that are against Siddhanta. But in general, the mood of the Goswamis and the mood of Mahaprabhu is that whenever there is something good and worthy of accepting, we should accept it, right? And so God is impersonal, some people say, and Mahaprabhu says, yes, he is. And God is personal, some people say, yes, he is. And God is the Lord in the heart, the yogis say, yes, he is, right? So the Brahman of the Advaitins, the Paramatma of the yogis, and the Bhagavan of the Bhaktas, Mahaprabhu brings all of them together and unifies them in his philosophy. Of course, Bhagavan is the supreme, that he makes clear. But nevertheless, when there is something good available, he's willing and ready to take it. One other example, the idea of Jivan Mukti, right? This is a term that the Advaitins present and other Vaishnavacharyas reject. They say you cannot be liberated while living still. But Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, no, you can be. Of course, he explains it differently than Shankaracharya's. The Shankaracharya's, in his idea, you get Jivan Mukti, you're liberated while you live by the cultivation of knowledge, by removing ignorance. And Srila Rupa Goswami says, yes, removing ignorance is of course good, but when we engage in the Lord's service and are fully absorbed in his bhakti, then Jivan Mukta sa uchyate, you become Jivan Mukta. So there again, he's happy to accept the idea of Jivan Mukti as opposed to other Vaishnavacharyas, because it's a concept that has truth in it, even if it wasn't understood properly by the Advaitins. So in this way, Mahaprabhu's philosophy is very sharp and hard-hitting when necessary, as we see in these dialogues, and also it's very unifying and bringing together as necessary, as we also see in these dialogues, and as I hoped to illustrate today.
Beautiful. What a beautiful, brilliant answer, Prabhu. Thank you so much. And oftentimes I've heard devotees also saying Bhaja Govindam. Bhaja Govindam Mudamate.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. So I think the same devotee has a follow-up question, and I'm going to put it here for you. If Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was against Shankara philosophy, which you kindly said that he wasn't, he was actually unifying everything in a beautiful way, then why he was initiated in Advaita Sannyasi order?
Yes. Actually, this is both a historical question and a philosophical question, right? So, in other words, we need to answer it in two ways. Philosophically speaking, I think I've already mentioned that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is not that he accepts everything or anything, but he is willing to take what is good and what is beneficial, what is salutary, anywhere he finds it. And in this case, there is nothing wrong in accepting sannyas, even in an Advaita Sampradaya, Advaitic tradition, if he is getting it from Keshav Bharati, if he is able to use that sannyas for the purposes of getting enough respect from the general population so that they will listen to him in presenting Vaishnava philosophy. So philosophically speaking, there is nothing objectionable, just as Jiva Goswami is happy to accept some understanding of Shankaracharya. In terms of historically speaking, at that time, Shankaracharya Sampradaya was the most dominant sannyas order that was present. And even Madhvacharya himself was initially initiated in the Shankara Sampradaya before he realized that he could not accept any of their conclusions, right? But the Dashanami sannyasis, Tirthas, Puris, Bharatis, Saraswatis, this was a very powerful community of sannyas. Vaishnav sannyas was there. It's very ancient. It wasn't invented at that time. But the dominant form of sannyas was the Advaitin sannyasis. And even the Vaishnav sannyasis had clear connections to Advaita sannyas at that time. In fact, a number of persons at that time, during Mahaprabhu's time, or a number of his associates who were obviously wonderful Vaishnavas, had accepted sannyas from the Shankara Sampradaya because that was the most convenient and most well-established and most respectable sangha of sannyasis in India at that time. And and so the evidence of that, of its usefulness, is the dialogue with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, where initially Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, he recognizes Mahaprabhu immediately. Oh, you are one of us. And Prakasananda Saraswati also, he immediately recognizes. He says, oh, you're a disciple of Keshava Bharati. Oh, very nice, right? And he accepts, he recognizes him right away. And then they're immediately part of that network that I was speaking of. And Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya says, okay, but you're just a Bharati, which is a lesser order of Advaita Sannyas. Let me make you into a Saraswati. Right? But then, going back to the philosophical, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu showed that ultimately he rejected this Ekadanda Sannyas by the Danda Bhanga Leela, which is so famous, where Nityananda Prabhu breaks Mahaprabhu's Sannyas Danda for multiple reasons. But one of those reasons is that the Lord is not actually an Ekadanda sannyasi. So that Tridanda sannyas is then properly introduced into our sampradaya by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur.
Beautiful, beautiful. You covered the question from all the different aspects. So appreciated. Kulatri Prabhu here is making a comment. I'm going to post it here. He says, Srila Prabhupada was so humble, but in certain circumstances was like a lion. What are the qualities that must be developed to understand how to present Vaishnava precepts to our audience? I had ability to milk cows, but did not have the philosophical acumen or humility, so I am dependent on qualified leaders to serve for progress. So Kuladipur was highlighting Srila Prabhupada in this similar mood. And if you want to address anything in his question, what are the qualities? I mean, he himself is a wonderful, wonderful devotee. And it is out of his humility that he's writing this question here. Let's take another question. I don't know how much time we have, but
I'll just say one line about that. I'll say that my obeisances first to Kuladri Prabhu, and to say that he brings up a very important point. And this is exactly where the expertise of the devotee is so important, that we have to be so aware of the situation, of the context, because Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, he was in these dialogues with Sarvabhauma and Prakasananda Saraswati. He was at times humble like a lamb, and at times powerful like a lion, right? And we see this in the qualities of every Vaishnava Acharya, that there are times when their humility will just break our hearts, and there are times when their lion-like preaching will also shatter our hearts. So both of those are there, and this is where we see that the expertise is needed, because if we become lion-like where humility is needed, we will really destroy someone's spiritual life. And if we are humble where we need to be like a lion, then we fail in our duty to properly represent Guru and Krishna.
Beautiful. Yes, absolutely. And Krishna gives the intelligence to do what at the right time. Yes. So here someone's mentioning, you mentioned it is an offense not to use our God-given talents in Krishna's service. So how can we purify our motivations behind such offerings, and so they're not tinged with our egoistic ambitions?
Yeah, wonderful question. Actually, purification of our intention is a lifelong process. Often we begin doing some service with the best of intentions. I want to lead kirtan for Krishna's pleasure, for the deity's pleasure. And then halfway through the kirtan, everyone's roaring and dancing and chanting and Haribol, Haribol. And at some point, my mind starts to think, wow, I'm really good at this. And look at me, I'm so popular. Wow, I'm a great kirtaniya. And all of a sudden, our motivation has shifted from using our God-given talents in God's service. It's shifted to, this is my talent, and it's helping me display my glories very nicely, right? When that happens, when that shift happens, we often don't even realize. It's so subtle. It happens so in such a fine way that all of a sudden we find our minds engaged in self-aggrandizement, even though we started off with the best of intentions, right? So if we recognize this, if we constantly check for our motivations, then we can try to recalibrate. Oops, I lost the purpose. Right? I thought I was giving this class for Krishna's pleasure and for Mahaprabhu's pleasure, and now all of a sudden it's become about me. I have to shift my focus again, right? I have to calibrate again, and I have to do it for his service. And sometimes if we're not able to do that, which often we're not, because we don't have that level of awareness and that strength, frankly, that inner strength to do that, then Krishna is very kind and he helps us. He reminds us. Maybe he'll take away a little bit of the success that we're getting in our seva. And in this way, force us to ask the question, okay, was I doing this for the praise I was getting or the success I was getting, or was I actually doing this for Krishna? Because now that I'm not getting the pats on the back, am I still eager to do this seva? Am I still enthusiastic, or have I lost all my enthusiasm? In this way, Krishna, he adjusts the circumstance to remind us of why is it we're actually doing what we're doing. And once we remember, then Krishna, again, the mercy and the opportunities continue to flow. So, in other words, if we're not able to do that, Krishna, he's always helping us. And usually he helps us through the association of Vaishnavas around us. When we work and live and serve in a community of devotees, then if we very easily come face to face with the impurities in our own motivation. And then it's up to us at that point. Do we push back arrogantly, or do we take it as an opportunity to go deeper, to purify our motivations, and to engage in our service with redoubled enthusiasm?
Here we have Shamala Kishori saying, what a wonderful answer. And I'm just going to second that. Beautiful, beautiful, and so genuine. Thank you so much. It's beautiful. We'll take this as the last question. We have our tech support from India, and I'm sure he wants to. Yes. Sakshi Gopal Prabhu from Mayapur is our tech support today. So we have Vamsi Dhari Das, and general question. In Bhagavatam, it is written after all the Puranas, then how come we see Bhagavad Mahatmya in other Puranas?
Yes, so this is a very good question. It's a historical question that we find, and in order to answer this question properly, actually, we need to examine how we understand history. It is very natural for all of us because we live in this modern world, and the modern world is shaped very much by understandings of history that are based on the Abrahamic traditions, which see history as functioning more or less in a linear fashion. That we start at one point, there is creation from nothing, and then that progresses over time in a sequence until we come to the end times, the apocalypse, where God's goal for creation, his purpose, is fully manifest. The Vedic tradition, on the other hand, actually all the Indic traditions, not just the Vedic tradition, they all recognize time as functioning in a circular fashion, or shall we say in a spiral, where we are improving, hopefully, or sometimes degenerating, but we're going around the same points over and over and over again. And so to cut a long discussion short, I'll just say that the sequencing of things in Shastra or between Shastras is never a very great concern for our acharyas, for the tradition, the Vaishnava tradition in general. And things rather layer on top of each other in what we would think is a rather confusing fashion, where Srila Vyasadeva is writing the Srimad Bhagavatam, right? But Sutta Goswami is in the Bhagavatam, and Sutta Goswami is post Vyasadeva, right? And so those initial verses, were that dialogue with Shonaka Rishi, and was that written by Vyasadeva? And Srila Jiva Goswami even goes so far as to say that the Bhagavatam in the heavenly planets is larger than the Bhagavatam here, right? So the point being that the Lord's Katha is constantly turning in this world, in the spiritual world. And as with the circle, any point you come to in the circle, and you take 2 points, is it before or after this point? Well, it depends. Are you moving like this? Are you thinking this is the starting point, or are you thinking this is the starting point? To say that one point comes before or after in a spiral or in a circle is a very difficult thing to do. You can do it on a line, but you can't really do it on a circle, right? So we have to really ask ourselves, do we necessarily have to take history in the way that we're taking it? And for a longer discussion of this, I can refer, was it Vamshi Dhari Prabhu? I can refer him to, I can refer him to a discussion that I had with Chaitanya Charan Prabhu on Chaitanya Charan Prabhu's podcast It's quite a lengthy dialogue, but it focuses on this point of history and of dating, since questions of history and dating are always so interesting for devotees and sometimes very confusing as well.
Here we have Narottam Priya Prabhu saying sadhu, sadhu. And thank you so much. Indeed, a wonderful answer. And whenever I get stuck with this time management kind of a program, I just say, Krishna's time. I kind of figured it out, that simple way to deal with it.
Yes, good point.
Thank you so much, Radhika Ramana Prabhu, for your time, for your wisdom, your life of devotion. You come across as such a genuine devotee. And, oftentimes we say it, or my son would say it, just keep it real. And that's very, very attractive. So please continue to keep this platform in your mind, and we would love to have you here again. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much to our audience for all these wonderful questions. We still have questions pouring in, but I think we should stop right now. Thank you so much, Radhika Ramana Prabhu. So thank you so much to our viewers. If you have any questions, continue to post them. We're hoping we will get Radhika Ramana Prabhu again in the future. Also, take a minute to subscribe to the GBC website. If I can have Sakshi Gopal Prabhu just scroll it on our screen here. If you subscribe to the website, you subscribe to our newsletter, which will keep you posted about all our events. We have an amazing lineup, and you cannot afford to miss. So thank you so much, everyone, for your active participation.
Thank you so much for this opportunity today to be with all of you.
So looks like Narada Rishi is asking him to bring out devotional aspects from that Leela. Wow. All right. We have requests for your emails. I don't know if you're into emails, but we post, maybe you can post your questions and comments here, and Radhika Ramana Prabhu can take it up at another point of time. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hare Krishna.